Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg, and this is the third video in my Historical Methods series where I talk about how we can apply different historical methods or ways of studying history to show the truth of Christianity. And in this video I'm going to be talking about the subject of author's intent. So the author of a source will have a purpose for writing it, and in the last video I talked about sources and the difference between primary and secondary sources. So the author of a scholarly secondary source, like a book, may have a thesis that they're trying to prove. And primary sources will have some type of purpose, which can vary. So someone may have written a letter to their friend, and the point of that source, the purpose of it, was to relay a certain message. Or maybe someone just simply has a diary, and the intention is to write down how they feel about what's going on around them and to document what happened that day. Another theme when it comes to the topic of the intention that an author of a source has is accounting for author bias. I talked about this a little bit in the last video, and how some people will say that the books of the New Testament are biased. And while people can write bias accounts, we have good reasons to believe that these New Testament books are not biased to a point where we can't use them, or that we shouldn't trust their accounts. So there's a few reasons for that. The first is that the Gospels in particular match the category of Greco-Roman biographies, and other Greco-Roman biographies and ancient sources in general mention miracles. Gary Habermas was talking about this in a talk, and I have his lecture linked in the description. But he talked about how some people will say, oh, well, the books of the New Testament and the Gospels in particular have miracles in them. Can we really treat these books as, biographies of Jesus when they mention, religious themes and miracles? Well, first of all, something I want to add to what Dr. Habermas says is a problem with that objection is that it's assuming that miracles don't happen, and that, miracles equals untrustworthy. So I would challenge that presupposition. But something that Dr. Habermas points out is that other ancient sources and Greco-Roman biographies have, talk about miracles too. So that kind of goes back to something I said in the last video of, if you're going to put that hard of a standard on the Bible and Jesus, are you going to throw out all these other sources too about other individuals and other events? And of course, scholars don't take ancient sources and we'll say, oh, well, that mentions Zeus or whatever, so we just no use in that. I'm not going to read anything further. Got to throw it in the fire, basically. You don't do that. There are certain methods for analyzing these sources to find out if they're trustworthy, and if certain details aren't, maybe other parts of it are. Second thing to consider to show that these sources aren't bias accounts that we can't trust is that Jesus' followers died for their faith. So you have someone like Paul or someone like Peter who preached the message of the risen Jesus, and they were willing to die for that. And really, when you think about it, if you were just making up a story, would you be willing to die for that if people were threatening to kill you? And especially if you weren't getting, any kind of worldly benefit out of it, would you make that up? Probably not. And actually, even secular scholars will say, people like the disciples and Paul must have actually believed they saw Jesus risen. And I've even seen some sources that were very, they weren't Christian based, they were quite critical of Christianity, that will say that, yeah, these men actually believed they saw Jesus risen. These secular scholars of these sources don't necessarily believe that Jesus did rise from the dead, but they say that these followers must have had a sincere faith to be willing to die for this. And you think about the case of Paul in particular, he was willing to give up his previous life to be persecuted and then eventually killed for it. So that's something to consider. And a third factor is that the gospel accounts have certain details that you wouldn't think to make up given this particular context. So there were certain things about the ancient culture that the New Testament was written in that it's like, for that time at least, in the worldly sense, there are certain details in the Gospels that people would have saw as embarrassing and hurt their cause. So of course, you're not going to make up details that that might embarrass you to other people. So what are some examples? Well, a few is that the gospel accounts record that women were the first ones to discover the empty tomb and also to see the risen Jesus. There's a whole list of people that in the New Testament of who saw Jesus, and the women are the ones that the two Marys were the ones that were reported to have discovered that tomb and seen Jesus first. And of course, that's not embarrassing or any big deal to us today. But in the ancient world, a woman's testimony wasn't seen as valid as a man's. So if you're making up this story, you wouldn't think to add that detail in there. It would be common sense that men discovered it. Maybe if you're making it up, the disciples discovered the body first, or maybe James, the brother of Jesus, discovered the tomb first. You wouldn't think to add this detail about women, because again, in that culture, that would have been seen as an embarrassing fact and kind of raise questions about the validity of the story. And if you want people to believe the story, you're not going to make up details that's going to cause people to question it. So that's likely. That shows that these accounts were likely just recording what was happening. And another example is you have the fact of disciples fleeing and hiding when Jesus is being arrested. So again, these are these men are supposed to be very devout followers of Jesus. They're kind of a big deal when it comes to early Christians. So that's kind of an embarrassing fact as well. It's like, Jesus is the key figure of Christianity, and these men that are out preaching that he's risen from the dead, it's like, you mean to tell me that they basically were acted like cowards and ran and hid? So that's another thing that you wouldn't make that up. Another important factor to consider when it comes to an author's intentions of a source is to make sure you get the context right. So I remember a discussion I had when I was working on my bachelor's degree, where we were talking about this, of when you're looking at sources for research, you should try to make sure that if you find maybe a sentence you want to quote and it's really punchy, you want to make sure that you understand what the author of that source means by that. Read what's around it. And in that particular discussion, there was somebody that was talking about how there was someone that basically, I think it was a film that someone had reviewed, and someone took a quote from a critic that said this movie or it said something about it's hilarious. Well, it turns out that the full quote was something to the effect of, it's hilarious how bad this was, but they kind of, the person who did that took just part of it and tweaked it without any context, and as historians we shouldn't do that. And so an example I'm going to look at is, I've heard some different critics of Christianity that will look at a verse in the book of Luke. It's Luke chapter 18 verse 25, and they kind of have some critiques of it, critiques of Christians based on this. So this verse is Jesus speaking, and it's a story of the rich young ruler. And Jesus says in verse 25, "For it is easier for a camel to go through the eye, or through a needle's eye, than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." And so I've heard some critics of Christianity look at that and say, see, Jesus said, having money's a sin, you're going to hell. And kind of the tone that they had of it was basically to try to say that Christians with any kind of wealth are hypocrites, and that, look how much Christianity's changed if you look at Christians today and look at what Jesus taught. Well, the Bible certainly does tell us that the love of money is a sin, but to this idea that, if you have, having any kind of money is a sin, we see that that's not the case, of what these critics are saying, if we just read the next couple verses. So the next couple verses clarify what he means. So verse 26, 27, "And they that heard it said, Who then can be saved? And he said," being Jesus, "The things which are impossible with men are possible with God." So Jesus says it's impossible with men, but not with God. And so we need to consider that when we look at this verse, where it talks about rich man entering into heaven in the eye of the needle and everything. Does it really mean what these critics who just take that verse and put an interpretation on it, does it really say what they say it does? So overall, we need to consider what the author's intention of a source is, and there are good reasons to believe that the followers of Jesus were telling the truth, for reasons such as that they were willing to die for what they were preaching, and that there are certain details that they wouldn't have thought to make up. So I hope you found this video informative and enjoyed it, and until next time, God bless.